This week we had a briefing from Intel with their sort of PR mastermind, or rather engineering mastermind, Tom Peterson. If you saw our on-location interview with Tom last year about XeSS and other Intel Arc stuff, you'll know that he's basically a man who loves to share detail. And man, we got a lot of detail in this briefing. Alex and I were there. There were three things, I guess, we talked about, Alex, starting with the Arc DX11 driver. We talked a bit about XeSS. I guess we can talk about that one a bit later. And they've got a new performance tool. Let's quickly talk about the DX11 driver for Arc, because similar to what they did with DX9, they've completely re-architected the DX11 driver. And by God, it needed it based on the recent tests that I've done.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that? I mean, we're basically seeing a continued evolution of Arc, and it's all heading in the right direction.
Yeah. So for them, it's interesting. Usually, even with the X11, you'd imagine for most games that a modern 13th generation Intel chip would provide enough CPU power to make something that is only as powerful as an A750 be GPU limited all the time. But with their previous driver, according to Intel's own data that they showed us, as well as just our general experience with Intel Arc under DX11, that was not the case necessarily. And that is kind of what the new driver backend is looking to address, where they are, for DX11 games, making it much more CPU light and CPU multi-threaded in the driver, which greatly enhances even something like an A750, which once again is not a very large and powerful video card. You would usually expect, like, oh yeah, you can be totally CPU bound on something like an RTX 4090 on a 13th gen CPU in some games. But this on an A750, which is, I don't know, 1/4 of, maybe even less, of the power of something like an RTX 4090. So there's that. There's something like that. And that's basically what it's all about. And as a part of this, I think going into it, they mentioned that it ranges from, in the number of DX11 titles, anywhere from on a i5, somewhere between 5 and 33%, I think, were actually, depending upon the title, when normalized, versus their previous drivers. And that's actually a pretty huge bump for a card that you would usually expect to be GPU limited. So that's awesome. That's what we want to see. We want to see them be more competitive so that it brings really, good products to that mid-range. And the A750 has been really cheap for a long time now.
Yeah. Yeah, they also showed us some data from i9, which showed that the gains from the new driver are more limited. And that's simply because the i9 is more powerful as a CPU. And it seemed to be, mostly down to the fact that it had higher clock and more cache, that it was more performant on the existing driver. But obviously, when you've got an A750, which is a $250 card, the concept of it being paired with an i9 is basically ludicrous.
Yeah, that's bad.
Yeah. So, basically, it looks like the new driver just addresses stuff like better memory management and isn't single-threaded like the old one was. I mean, I brought up in the meeting that I felt that the DX11 performance on the existing driver was similar to what I was experiencing with a Radeon back in the day, which had a single-threaded DX11 driver. This is really crucial because in my GPU review of like the budget cards, I just went back and tested random DX11 games, and Assassin's Creed Unity was a disaster until they patched it, which may have been as a result of my disaster. Who knows? And Call of Duty Infinite Warfare just didn't work after it just sort of crashed in the first level.
My goodness.
And just elsewhere, in Crysis 3 Remastered, it was interesting to note that in less dense areas, it could compete with the RTX 3060, but in more dense areas, there was a drop-off in performance. And that's exactly what used to happen on the old AMD driver, and it's exactly because it's a single-threaded driver. So, yeah, I mean, this is essential stuff for Arc, and it's all happening. And I guess, where do we go next? Because Arc was delayed, and it's now gone from like a mid-range product to, sort of like a $250 product.
Right.
Which is sort of almost entry level these days, I'd say, for a mainstream GPU. So, progress on Arc, and it's great to see it. And no sort of indication of new products, unfortunately, but I can't believe they're just going to pull out of the market as many people believe.
No, I can't believe that. There's that doesn't even make sense because like a lot of computing in terms of AI is moving towards things that what GPUs were, and that's what they have, and those are their products that are AI competitive for them at the moment. So they wouldn't get out of it. I don't even know why anyone would say any of those things. Whatever.
Well,
precedent.
Yeah.
It's because, Arc has been delayed. It's because it didn't quite hit its mooted performance targets. It was supposed to be taking on like 3070 and 2080 Ti, and it didn't. But, growing pains, right? I mean, you don't sort of overcome 20 years of legacy baggage, that the others have got by, pulling out. It's an iterative an iterative process. It's going to take time. So yeah, that was really interesting. It's great to see. The other thing, which is probably a lot more interesting, is that, well, here's the thing, right? Most of the benchmarking tools out there are based on an open source tool called PresentMon. And it turns out that PresentMon is open source, but it is primarily Intel engineers that developed it. It's used in NVIDIA FrameView, it's used in CapFrameX, it's used in OCAT. All of these benchmarking systems all use PresentMon. Now, Intel has come out with its own spin on a interface and a tool based on PresentMon. Got some footage of it here. It's really exciting because, it's basically adding stuff to PresentMon that, well, Tom Peterson's been hinting at it for I think years.
He's told it to us, like, I think he even told it to us when he was working at the other company that he was interested in this idea. I remember the parking lot, him coming up to us. He's like, what about CPU boundedness? What about driver boundedness? In his very Tom Peterson way, you can imagine him saying it.
Yeah, conversations in parking lots. That's the way it goes.
But, it's like Deep Throat. He like comes over, shuffles over. There's a car behind him with the lights. You could imagine
let's take a look at the tool here. So I've actually installed the tool here on my 4800S desktop kit, which is using the Xbox Series X CPU. And I've combined it with the Radeon RX 6700 non-XT, which is the closest you're going to get to a console GPU. It's very, very similar to the PlayStation 5's GPU. Why did I do this and not like a 4090 with 3900K? Really simple, right? It's all about finding performance hotspots, bottlenecks, and you're going to have far fewer of those on a high-end system. But on this console equivalent spec, you're going to get some interesting data. So this is basically what the default interface looks like. And, it's pretty good. You get stuff like GPU temperatures, GPU voltages, memory utilization, frame rates, frame times. But what's new and really exciting from a Digital Foundry perspective, and I think from a benchmarking perspective in general, is this second graph that we've got here, which is about frame time and what they call GPU busy. So Alex, do you want to talk about GPU busy? Because it's potentially game-changing in our understanding of how PC games work.
Yeah, so GPU busy is, well, right now, what I do in a game to assess whether or not it is CPU limited is, well, there's a certain feel and visual look to it, I would say, in general, even without looking at numbers. But when you do look at numbers in your current software, it's really helpful to look at GPU utilization. And if it's below 99% or below 100%, you have a general idea that you are probably CPU bound. Now, there are actually things that could be tripping that up. You could say it could actually be PCIe bandwidth bound. It could be technically things like IO bound. You wouldn't really know. You just have to get a sense of it through other means at that point in time. But GPU weight, as it's described here, is describing the amount of, first of all, there's a line describing the amount of time it took for the GPU to bring out the frame. And then the total frame time essentially is like, there's two graphs going alongside of each other in parallel, two lines. Sorry. And due to the difference between these two lines, you can actually see how long the GPU is having to wait. in these lines. And that is what it's waiting on. And it's going to typically, right now, it's not broken down into smaller subcategories, which is something that Tom Peterson mentioned that is probably something that the future versions of the tool could possibly be able to do. But right now, you can actually say, due to GPU weight, you can literally tell in this awesome graphed out way when you're not CPU or GPU limited. And that's incredible. Along a graph. It's incredible. Yeah. I love it.
So I've got a couple of examples here that demonstrate this. We're going to go to, the classic Gotham Knights introduction sequence. So yeah, this is basically 1440p resolution using TSR to get up to 4K. So it's kind of very console-like, right? And we've got ray tracing on. So this is broadly equivalent to the consoles running in their 30 FPS mode. And you can see areas on the graph here where the cyan line is higher, i.e. the frame time is longer than the GPU. So we're kind of, this is an indication that we're CPU limited in these scenarios. And you'll also see a corresponding drop in GPU frequency and utilization because, the GPU is not being used because the CPU is hogging is taking up the majority of processing here. So yeah, this is an example here, and it kind of varies between the two lines being concurrent, which looks like balance, as Tom Peterson put it, and then you've got areas where the cyan line is higher, which is where you're CPU limited. And if we go on to our next Gotham Knights run, where I've actually stuck it down to TSR performance mode, you're always CPU limited, but right. You really want those bars to be closing up. Similarly, we've got a clip here of Flight Simulator, broadly equivalent console settings, Xbox Series X settings here. Ironically running on what is close to the PlayStation 5 GPU. But again, it's pretty much always the case that the CPU is the limiting factor here. So what you can actually do here is you can say, well, if I'm CPU limited and there's not much I can do about that in the settings, what I can do is actually turn up my graphics, because it's basically free performance on the GPU that's just sitting there. And this is really, really interesting. There's also, just as an example here, moving into A Plague Tale Requiem, where we were convinced it was kind of CPU limited, but you can actually see that the yellow and the cyan lines there are in balance. This is kind of what we want. So even in this massive rat-infested scene, both CPU and GPU are looking at pretty much balanced performances. This is really, really interesting stuff. There's also a lot of customization features. So going back to the beginning of my second Plague Tale clip, you can see here how you can actually tweak the displays on the right there to get the information you need, the scales that you want, the amount of frames being covered. What can I say? This is next level stuff from Intel here. Exciting, right? Great. Do you think you're going to be using it, Alex?
It's going to take a little bit to get it perfectly in my videos because I got to run it and I got to make sure I get like a setup that looks visually pleasing to a degree. I want to use it specifically to show off moments of games, because right now, like, my Baldur's Gate video is going to be out soon, and when I talked about Redfall and Jedi Survivor, those are games where this is actually really useful to see, because always when these games come out, people post a comment online, I have an RTX 3080, I'm using really reasonable settings and this game runs like crap. And they don't post their CPU always. Like, everyone always thinks everything's GPU limited, and they don't take the time to realize that their CPU is such a big important part of this. And I hope this is about, I'm going to use it in my videos, I'm going to show it off, I want to start using it. But I hope there's a somewhat of a proliferation or democratization of the idea that you can be CPU limited in a game. So people start realizing that more often. And these very basic lines that any human eye can see will show it, and it'll get more informed feedback for games. Like right now you go to Steam forums, when a game comes out and has poor performance, people just write random junk in there. And this would be a good way for people to just post just a screenshot and be like, this is the problem. This is really
Yeah.
good.
That's
I like
actually
that
really,
feedback.
really good point, actually, Alex. Because yeah, I mean, if we explain this and tell the audience what those lines mean, if your cyan line is above your yellow line, then it's not the GPU that's the problem, right? There's something
Right.
else in there that's an issue, and it could be the CPU, it could be PCIe bandwidth. It's not 100% clear, but the prime suspect will be the CPU and memory bandwidth.
Yeah. So that's one thing that what I mentioned to Tap, and what he said it would be a great way to advance this tool in the future would be, right now you could technically also say, is it waiting on DirectX, which would imply maybe draw call bound, for example. So that's one aspect of what could be bounding the CPU performance. And if there could also, then you would have an idea of whether or not, if it's draw call bound, if it's driver bound by something else, or technically, I guess you could break out the subcomponents into this boundedness as well too, because it would also have ideas of these things. How they would represent that graphically is a different question. Maybe the color of the line changes or something like that. I have no idea what they would do, but I think this is an incredible beginning for a new powerful performance tool, and I hope things like CapFrameX, I'm pretty sure CapFrameX will take it over. CapFrameX is always about evolving, so that's what I would like to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And FrameView and all the other tools, they're all based on PresentOne, and this is like a free upgrade. I mean, it's, it'll be on the GitHub, so hopefully they will integrate all of this stuff. What I'm really interested in doing is taking all of this data and actually just giving it to us in a CSV file that we can actually produce our own visualizations, which might be a bit more comprehensible to our audience.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots of stuff going on there. Really, really interesting stuff. The final thing I want to talk about Intel was we did actually ask Tom Peterson about XeSS 1.2 specifically because a lot of people are really interested in it. A lot of people are noticing now that it's offering the DP4A path, which is for non-ARC GPUs, a big bunch of them, is actually now offering quality advantages, if not performance advantages, over FSR2, right? Mm-hmm. Which is great. Mm-hmm. And this was an interesting conversation because Tom didn't really seem to want to talk too much about that, and actually seemed to be a bit disappointed that they, in the handling of how XeSS on other competing systems had rolled out.
Yeah, I get why though, because people would load up XeSS on their GPU, which was probably not an Intel one, and they would say the quality's fine, but it's really harming my performance versus FSR2 or whatever in this game, or DLSS for that matter. And then they would go, what's the point of this? And they would think badly maybe of XeSS, and it had the exact same naming, and maybe they wouldn't realize it's a different version of XeSS. The real version that runs on Intel Arc is qualitatively a good deal better, and then it's also a good deal more performant on Intel Arc as well too. So that's the impression they gave off, and it had the exact same name. So it kind of maybe actually hurt their mind share a bit. And I would tend to agree a little bit.
Yeah. We actually, I was thinking to myself, well, call it XeSS Lite. And then literally Tom said he called it XeSS Lite. But he did say that it was going to find great utility on Intel integrated graphics.
Right.
So it'd be interesting to see how that rolls out compared to FSR2. I think at the moment we're seeing a quality advantage over FSR2, but maybe the performance isn't quite as strong as FSR2.
Yes.
However, though, if you're budgeting, for the look of the overall game, in terms of settings management, then it may make sense to use XeSS instead of FSR2. For example, I've got some footage here of Remnant 2 running on the ANEO Air 1S, which is a AMD-based handheld. And I'm using 900p 30 frames per second and XeSS balanced mode here because it looks better than FSR, and I've got the GPU budget to do that and retain 30 frames per second, right? It's great to have options, I think, and XeSS is only going to get better. But yeah, that's our Intel news. Sorry, there wasn't much to bring you in on there, John.
Oh, I know. I missed that conversation you guys had with them. So It is interesting to hear about, though, and I hope that Intel continues plugging away in the PC market on GPU side, because they are doing some very important and interesting work, and I think they have a real shot at capturing some market share if they continue down this path. Because I think the general opinion of Intel stuff is that, yeah, they're targeting lower end hardware right now, but their products are well regarded, they're affordable, they're doing great work with XeSS. I think people are feeling good about them.
Yeah, the ray tracing performance is also strong.
I mean their performance is actually very, very good. It's amazing for the price, I'd say. Their ARC cards are awesome right now, but I would really like to see them tackle the high-end Halo product at some point, because
wouldn't we all?
Yeah, that would be tough though, but we'll see.